Good morning and bonjour. Welcome to the second session of Gwillim Online, Indian Birds in Art and Literature in Early 19th Century Madras. Bienvenue à la deuxième présentation du projet Gwillim Virtuel. I'm Nora Shalan, coordinator of the Gwillim Project Online. Victoria Dickinson, the convener of the Gwillim Project, has asked me to welcome you to this event. The Gwillim Project, Women, Environment, and Networks of Knowledge and Exchange in the Company Raj is a research initiative of the Rare Books and Special Collections branch of the McGill Library in Montreal, funded through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute. The Gwillim Project centers around the unpublished correspondence and artwork of Lady Elizabeth Gwillim and her sister, Mary Simmons, who moved to India in 1801 when Sir Henry Gwillim was appointed a judge in the Supreme Court in Madras. The Blackerwood collection at McGill holds paintings of birds, fish, and flowers by Elizabeth Gwillim, while Mary Simmons's wonderful portraits and landscapes are held by the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich. The sisters' rich correspondence to family and friends is in the British Library. The project brings together an international network of scholars from diverse fields in Canada, the UK, India, and the United States, and we look forward to welcoming this expanded audience as we share our research. A special welcome as well to the members of the network who are joining us today. We would like to thank all those who have made this event possible, in particular Emily Zinger and Lauren Williams, Blackerwood librarian. Emily will be watching in the chat, and if you have any problems in viewing the webinar, please send a note to the chat and she'll help you get sorted. This webinar is being recorded and you will be able to view it later on our YouTube channel. We will be sending the link as well as information on the upcoming presentation in Gwillim Online to all those who registered. It's my pleasure now to introduce the moderator, Dr. Robert Montgomerie, professor in the Department of Biology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, who will be well known to listeners from the birding community. Bob will be introducing our panelists and will be posing your questions to the speakers at the end of their presentation. Please again use the chat function to ask your questions. Thank you for attending et je vous souhaite bonne conférence.
Thanks, Nora, and hi everybody. It's my pleasure to be introducing today's speakers in this series of seminars from the Lady Gwillim Project. Today we have two seminars, Dr. Subramanya and Dr. Urfi, who are both right now in India, where it's about 6:30 p.m. on Monday evening. Each speaker will present for about 20 minutes, and that will be followed by a general question period. So as Nora said, please type your questions into the chat as you think of them, so that we have a good pile of questions at the end of the seminars. Dr. Subramanya will speak first. Subru, as he likes to be called, will be speaking today about the paintings that Lady Gwillim made of Indian birds. That are now at the Blackerwood Library in Montreal. Before he retired in 2018, Subbu was professor of entomology at the University of Agricultural Science in Bangalore, and now he's working as a volunteer for the State Department in Karnataka in support of various conservation initiatives. During a visit to McGill in 1993 and 94, Subbu studied the paintings by Lady Gwillim in the Blackerwood collection and wrote about her work in the Indian newsletter for birdwatchers. And that's what he's going to tell us about today. Subbu, it's all yours.
Thank you, Nora and Dr. Montgomerie for your kind introductions. Hope you can see my screen. Thank you for the introductions. And what I'm going to talk today is about the Indian bird paintings by Lady Elizabeth Gwillim. And in 1993 and 94, I used to be a visiting faculty at the McDonald campus of McGill University. McDonald campus is located about 30 kilometers southwest of Montreal. And while I was there very recently, the collections in McGill Library has been digitized and was available online for people to browse through. And one of the nights in February 1994, when I was browsing through the holdings on birds in McGill libraries, one item caught my eye. It said, Indian bird paintings, 1801 to 1807, Lady Elizabeth Gwillim. I really sat up because I never heard about these paintings, and later I found out that these paintings were held at the Blackroot Library in downtown Montreal. Next morning, phoned me at the main campus of McGill University. It was February, just like this, in Montreal at the time. And I lived through one of the worst winters that year. And later I made to the Red Path building where the Blackroot Library is housed. After identifying myself, I requested access to see these paintings, and what I saw was something really amazing. These were watercolors done life-size of the birds of India. And in the next 2 hours I spent there in Blackroot, I tried to gather up as much information as possible on the paintings and the artist. And later that year, when I returned to India, I wrote about whatever I gathered about the paintings and the paintings in McGill University in the newsletter for birdwatchers. Because at that point of time, not many birdwatchers, ornithologists in India knew even the existence of these paintings. Even though Dr. Casey Wood had written an article in IBIS on the paintings, and the same article had been published the next year in 1926 in the Journal of Bombay Naturalist Society. But at that point of time, it was a bit difficult to access these journals. And to talk about how Casey Wood, how the paintings came to be at Blackroot Library, Dr. Casey Wood was one of the founders of Blackroot Library, and he was also a curator, and he was quite consumed with the passion to make Blackroot one of the finest naturalist libraries in the world. In 1924, during one of his forays, while searching in the basement of a London antique store, Dr. Wood chanced upon a portfolio of paintings containing 121 birds paintings, 30 paintings of fishes, 12 of flowers, and one of a crocodile. He bought the whole lot for $76. Over the next few years, he started gathering up as much details as possible on the paintings and the painter. The artist of these paintings was Lady Elizabeth Gwillim. To talk about Elizabeth Gwillim, she was born in Hereford in England in April 1763. She and her sister Mary Simons learned watercolor painting from George Samuel, one of the very well-known landscape artists in England. She married Henry Gwillim in 1784, and in 1801, Henry Gwillim was knighted and was appointed as the judge of Madras High Court. The same year, Elizabeth, Sir Henry Gwillim, and her sister Mary Simons traveled to Madras. They lived at Santham in a garden house. Both Elizabeth and Mary wrote series of letters to their mother and sister in Hereford and London. Between 1801 and 1807, Elizabeth and sister painted birds, plants, fishes, insects, buildings, and landscapes of the places they lived around. Elizabeth Gwillim died in Madras on 21st December 1807. She was buried at the St. Mary's Church in Fort St. George, Madras. If ever you get to St. Mary's Church, you can find a grave inside, very close to the main entrance. And the inscriptions on her grave reads, Elizabeth, the loving wife of Sir Henry Gwillim, aged 44 years, 8 months. Here she lies, 1807. This is a mass, the present day map of Chennai showing old Gwillim localities. This is a place where Fort St. George is, where Dr. Gwillim, Mr. Gwillim worked, Sir Gwillim worked as a judge. And this is Santham, where they lived in a garden house. And this painting by Mary Simons shows the very garden house that they lived in. And also the sisters traveled to 2 other locations frequently. One was to live in an Armenian house very close to St. Thomas Mount. And also they visited a cotton farm owned by one Mr. Webb at Pummel. And after procuring the paintings, Casey Wood tried to get all the birds in the paintings of Elizabeth Gwillim identified. For this, he enlisted the support of none less than E.C.S. Baker and also Harry Swan. Stuart Baker was an authority on Indian birds, and Harry Swan published books on British avifauna and also had a special interest in birds of prey. And these are some of the gems that you get to see of Elizabeth Gwillim's paintings. All these paintings are done life-size. And what I've done is I've tried to plot the size of the birds and see how they fit in, what sizes they are. And these orange dots indicate the size of each of these 121 birds that Elizabeth painted. And you see here that the largest of the paintings that she did was of a woolly neck stork that measured 93 by 68 centimeters. Smallest was that of a jungle prenia, which measured 20 by 25 centimeters. And the widest of them all was of a Brahmini kite that measured 69 by 79 centimeters. And as to how Elizabeth painted the birds, it's quite evident from one of the letters that Mary has later written to her sister, Henrietta, in London. She writes, the birds are brought in alive. An old man who takes care of these birds and keeps them in proper manner. And the birds are that are brought in are wrapped up in clothes so that they don't thrash around or injure them. And the large water birds like cranes, storks are fastened by their legs in different parts of the garden. And they are fed with the quantity of fish and frogs to maintain them. All the birds that are brought in are blindfolded so that they don't get scared unduly. And they had pigeons, partridges, quails, even a cassowary on the garden. And also Mary writes, Betty sits opposite to me drawing. The old man is employed to turn the bird about in proper attitude. This sums up how exactly Elizabeth went about painting birds. And as most of the birds are of life-size paintings, I just wanted to know whether Elizabeth used the right-size paper to paint most of these birds. And majority of them fit in that based on the size of the birds, use the drawing sheets to paint them life-size. But 10 of these paintings don't fit the bill because they have been painted in undersized drawing sheets, indicating that probably Elizabeth suffered from the dearth of right-sized papers. In a letter to her sister in London, she writes, I shall want colors and paper for drawing, but hope you'll have sent them, indicating that every material that Elizabeth and Mary used had to be sourced from England. And also, in all, Elizabeth painted about 120 paintings. These represent about 104 species of birds in and around Madras. And a great majority of them include water birds and birds of prey. And these 104 species represent 18 avian orders and 40 bird families. And also try to look at from where all Elizabeth could have sourced her subjects. For this, I've looked at the distribution maps of all the 104 species. For this, I have referred to the Handbook of Birds of India and Pakistan by Salim Ali and Ripley, and also looked at the Threatened Birds of Asia for the historical distribution of birds. And I also looked at the more recent maps of distribution of birds available on eBird. And from this, I gather that about 97 species of birds were sourced from in around Madras, present-day Chennai. And one of them was not found in India, so that it has to be sourced from outside. And two other species were never found in South India, even during the historical time. So they had to be procured from outside South India. And three other species came from Western Ghats because they are not found outside Western Ghats. And one species was one painting is of village rooster, so the domesticated birds. In addition, Elizabeth also observed about 15 species of birds, which is evident from the letters that she has written to her mother and sister. Thus, in all, Mary Gwillim documented through her paintings and observation 112 species of Madras area. And this map shows the distribution of these birds that Elizabeth sourced for her paintings. So 97 of the paintings came from Madras, present-day Chennai area. 3 of them came from Western Ghats. One species, the crested wood partridge, has to be sourced from Borneo and Sumatra. And as to the greater adjutant, it has to be sourced. It had to be sourced from northeastern India, whereas the Saras crane had a much larger distribution in the central and north and northeastern India. These are the paintings of the crested partridge and also the domestic rooster. And I have a feeling that even this crested partridge came from a domesticated stock, mainly because you find 3 other birds foraging out in the open, whereas in the native habitat, crested partridge is a very shy bird, which inhabits wet evergreen tropical rainforest in Sumatra and Borneo. So I don't think this bird was the wild bird. And also when you compare it with the wild crested partridge, you find that the white patch on the forehead is lacking. So quite possibly this was from a domestic stock. And as to the Swaras crane and greater adjutant, and looking at the historical distribution, you find that these birds were never found in South India. The red dots are the records from pre-1950s, and in both the species, you find that these birds were never found in South India. And as to the backgrounds, and most of the backgrounds were done in 2 stages, because Elizabeth painted these birds in full, with the feet showing where every toe and every claw is in place, and the backgrounds were added much later. And this first stage painting is true with every painting that she has done, all the 121 paintings, because whether it's a bird of prey, a cormorant, or a galliformed bird, it's the same that the legs are painted properly, indicating that the backgrounds were added much later, because she never painted any bird in its native setting. And as to the adding backgrounds, Elizabeth writes to her sister Hetty in London that tell George Samuel that I got down one of his drawings. I'm working away after his manner in backgrounds to my birds, indicating that these backgrounds were added much later, following the style of George Samuel, who was their painting instructor. And when you look at the backgrounds in Elizabeth's painting, you find that 56 paintings come with detailed backgrounds. 39 of them have no background, and 26 of them come with a little bit of background, like a branch painted there, or a patch of ground around the legs. And these are some of the finest of the paintings which have wonderful background that Elizabeth has painted, that of the Woolly-necked stork, the great cormorant, Boneless eagle, Brahminy kite, or the Asian quail, and here are some more. And even she illustrated some juvenile and adult plumages in some birds, in some cases the male and female as well. And these are the paintings which had no background at all. And also that probably she did not have time to paint backgrounds, so some of these paintings don't have any backgrounds. And the presence of absence of background probably depended on these 3 points. Elizabeth added components to the background that she was quite familiar with. That's why you get to see some of the very familiar trees found in gardens and the places that she roamed about. And most of the habitat information appears to have been collected from her bird trappers or suppliers based on where these birds were captured. And for some of the birds that she did not know their whereabouts, the paintings have no background, or probably she did not have time to add backgrounds to some of these paintings which lack backgrounds. And I've identified about 20 different components of the backgrounds. And these include, this is a frequency distribution of all those backgrounds in 121 paintings. And these components include temples, palmyra palms, coconut palms, trees, climbers, boulders, bushes, buildings, and stables and horses, even some paintings, small animals like fish and dragonflies. And this painting is very interesting, where Elizabeth has tried to illustrate a local tradition. This is a painting of a Brahminy kite, and in the side of the screen, you see 3 natives standing, looking up at the Brahminy kite. And the significance of these 3 natives standing here comes to the fore when you read through her letter, where she has written to her sister. The natives feed Brahminy kites with great care and consider them as gods. They must see them every Sunday morning before they eat, and whenever they see them, make to them what they call as dandamalu. Dandamalu is the term in Telugu, indicates salutation. And further she writes, a salam is a salute to a master. A dandamalu is to a god or a Brahmin. It is holding up the hands up close as we do in prayer. So salam is a namaste like this. A dandamalu is hands held up praying to the god. And this is the close-up of the natives that she has painted. You see one elderly person admiring the Brahminy kite, whereas the youngster is doing a salam to the master. And here is another native doing dandamalu to the Brahminy kite. And in Hindu mythology, Brahminy kite is considered as Garuda, the celestial carrier or the one of Lord Vishnu. And Garuda is also often referred to as king of birds, since it is worshipped. And Elizabeth has tried to depict this local tradition in her painting. It's not that she made up all her backgrounds, or some of the background components are really real. In the same painting, in the background, you see a hillock with a temple on top. And here's a close-up of that. And this temple has twin gopurams or pagodas. And this temple exists even today. Here it is. This is the Ranganatha temple of Tiruniramalai, which is located about 2.5 kilometers from Pammal, where Elizabeth used to visit the cotton farm of Mr. Webb. And this temple was built somewhere in 10th and 14th century. And this is one of the finest of Elizabeth Gwillim's paintings. This is of a juvenile crested serpent eagle, where every feather is in place. And the painting is perfect with respect to proportions and posture. And in the background, you see a climber with red fruits. And this fruit can be very easily identified. There's a ivy gourd, the Coccinia grandis, which is a very popular vegetable cultivated very widely in Tamil Nadu in South India. And you can make, and it's also grown as a hedge plant in the kitchen gardens. You can make a very tasty, spicy poriyal. And there's a picture of a poriyal that I took 2 weeks back to add this photograph to the presentation here. In addition, Elizabeth also observed birds, and she writes about her observations in a letter to her sisters. And she's written about koils, the black drongos sitting on top of the cow's head, and which, because of which they are also called as cowbirds. And she talks about sunbirds flitting about on the flowers. And she equates the call of oriental magpie pigeon to that of a nightingale. She talks about a red-whiskered bulbul with a jaunty crest, and of crows which enter houses to steal food kept on tables, and of different types of owls that she has observed, 3 species of cuckoos that she has painted, of parakeets, and the colorful Indian roller which has a very harsh call. And she writes about 2 species of bee-eaters, 3 species of kingfishers, of sparrows building nests inside houses. And she writes that we have vultures in open parts, common kites, hawks in great many numbers. She also talks about partridges and quails as kept as cage birds. She makes a special mention about Bayaview birds, its habit of building hanging nests on top of date palms and coconut palms. She even talks about, writes about the nest architecture of Bayaview birds, and recounts her seeing one of the largest colonies of Bayaview birds on top of a coconut palm tree in the gardens of Sir Thomas Strange, who was a Chief Justice of Madras High Court during that time. Elizabeth also makes a mention about falconry in Madras. And she writes to her sister, the more people are very fond of hawking. These people always carry on their face a trained hawk. I've seen 7 to 8 men standing to talk together in the street, each with a hawk on his hand. It is widely believed that falconry came to India with the Mughals, and the sport flourished during the Mughal era. It is claimed that, however, in ancient Sanskrit literature, it's written that falconry existed in India much before, in 1029 AD, where the Sanskrit text makes a reference to the art of falconry in about how to maintain falcons that are used in hunting of animals. And Elizabeth's documentation of 112 birds is a second ever observation of birds that occurred there. And the first ever account is that of Edward Buckley, who was a surgeon and naturalist at Fort St. George. And his article has been published in John Ray's Synopsis Avium, where he writes about 24 species of birds that he encountered within Fort St. George. And most of these birds can be identified. And these do throw up some surprises, because the white-cheeked barbet and the schema, they're not found in these parts in the present day. And also one of the Indian artists colored one of his plates also. And there's a second plate where you can identify some of the species here. I'll, to sum up, the 112 birds observed by Lady Elizabeth Gwillim is the second known documentation of bird life of Madras. Lady Gwillim painted birds in Madras 2 decades before John James Aduma started painting birds of America in the 1820s. Also, Elizabeth's work of art was done much before T.C. Jordan, a pioneer in Indian ornithology, who published his, before he published his 50 illustrations in Indian ornithology, and also much before he published the Birds of India during 1862 and 1864. Thus, Lady Elizabeth work of art becomes very significant, both ornithologically and also historically. I'll leave you with that, and a lot of people to thank. And over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Subbu, for bringing Lady Gwillim's work to life so well. It's truly impressive what you can learn by looking at old paintings and actually knowing something about the birds and the local areas that she painted in. Don't forget, if you have any questions for Subbu, please write them in the chat, and I'll read them at the end of Dr. Urfi's seminar. Okay, our second speaker today is Dr. Abdul Jamal Urfi, who is currently on the faculty of Environmental Studies at the University of Delhi in India. Dr. Urfi will talk to us today about the writings about Indian birds during the British Colonial Period, and this provides really nice context for the work that Lady Gwillim did in India in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Dr. Urfi is an ornithologist who spent 30 years studying the painted stork, and that's resulted in the book about the ecology and conservation of that bird in 2011. And he's also written a book about bird watching, and he's edited a literary anthology of birds in India that are both available, I see, on Amazon. Dr. Urfi will present his seminar, and then we'll follow this with some questions. Over to you, Dr.
Urfi. Thank you, Dr. Bob, for this kind introduction. We've just heard a wonderful presentation on bird paintings of Lady Elizabeth Gwillim. My talk is also going to be about Indian birds, though, as I will explain as we go along, it will be more focused on the writings about Indian birds in British India. For someone like me who has been involved in the study of birds for a long time, I realized quite early that it was absolutely essential to dive into the wealth of literature on Indian birds left behind by British writers in pre-independence India, or British India, as it were. As I continued to read more and more of their works, I realized that the British writings on Indian birds ought to be read for not just the obvious reason, which is to glean information, often historical presence, absence of bird species in different areas, and about the habits and ecology of different species, but for other reasons as well. One of them is reading for sheer pleasure. The style of writing in those books written by naturalists in British India is often so refreshing and wonderful that many of them have to be read just for their style and descriptions. A good example of natural history writings with which some of you might be familiar is the stories on hunting down man-eating leopards and tigers by Jim Corbett, who wrote world-famous books like The Man-Eaters of Kumaon, The Man-Eating Leopard of Rudraprayag, etc. These books illustrate a powerful and a gripping narrative and an easy style. So these are some of the reasons, but the other reason about which I'll focus in this presentation is that the wealth of British writings about birds doesn't just tell us about avian creatures, but also about how they lived and interacted in India. So that's going to be the focus of my talk. How colonialism influenced the development of science and technology in countries like India. Enough research has been done on it and continues to be done to the day. A lot of substantial scholarship has accumulated on this subject, and into which we need not go into the details out here. It should suffice to say that for historians of science and students of history in general, this is an important area of research. But in a general sort of a way, I have remained interested in these themes. As far as writing on birds by British writers is concerned, I got interested in them while working on an anthology of writings on Indian birds, in which I devoted quite a few sections devoted to the British writings. which were roughly from the period of 1850s till the early decades of the 20th century. The work of the Gwillim sisters, especially the high quality of natural history observations, as well as the drawings on birds, about which Professor Subbu just spoke just now, uh, uh, actually are from a period earlier to what I'll be focusing on in my talk. The literature on Indian ornithology has been compiled by several people, and from India, some workers such as Ashish Pitte, Bikram Grewal, and others have produced databases. Internationally also, a lot of databases exist about literature that is available on Indian birds, especially from the British period. Uh, the titles of the books, their authors, the years of their publication, and other vital information is easily available. So it was possible for me to pick up the threads of several stories, some of which will be told here. But first, let us examine a few general aspects. What about natural history writings by Indians themselves prior to the arrival of Europeans on Indian shores? What sort of writings were they, and how were they different from the works by European writers in India in the 18th, 19th, and early decades of the 20th century? In literatures from ancient India, we know some valuable information on birds and other animals exists. Some of it has been compiled and is available in translation in the wonderful book, Birds in Sanskrit Literature by Dr. Dave. As is evident from this book, even though much of the information on birds is often intertwined with myths and stories, it is still of considerable value. From a later time period, the observations on natural history recorded in the memoirs of the Mughal emperors, Babur and Jahangir, are well known and easily available in translation. However, the works of British writers is different from Indian works on a few accounts, and let us see how. The first is that they are more detailed and region specific, telling us exactly what species of birds are found in a particular area. It is what bird watchers today call checklists, the presence absence information. It is the vital information in context of modern ecology, which attempts to explain the range and distribution of various species of plants and animals across vast geographical scales. And more often than not, in the writings of British writers, we find a detailed description of the study area with much useful information about climate, vegetation, relief, etc. So taken together, this is very important information in terms of understanding why a particular species is found in a particular area, or what explains the presence absence of different species in different parts of the world. So if I can have the next slide, please. Many of the descriptions of Indian birds left behind by British writers provide very accurate and scientific descriptions. And for example, in this text that is reproduced here, we see how the comparative method, which is a standard accepted method in zoology, has been used to describe the hawk cuckoo by comparing it with other common birds that one is likely to encounter in India. We have mentioned the natural history writings of Mughal emperors of India, and so it may be worthwhile mentioning that the British natural history writings differ from them in one important respect. Among the Raj era naturalists, we find writings by common people, administrative officers, soldiers, policemen, lawyers, surgeons, doctors, etc. They were all servants of the empire, first of the East India Company and later the Crown, besides, of course, explorers and scientists. While all of them were in some way aligned to the ruling power, that is the British, directly or indirectly, but from an Indian perspective, they were regarded as rulers by native residents. And yet, they were mostly common people and in fact mostly not members of British royalty. I think this point is important. I think it makes a huge difference whether it is an emperor who dictates his observations to his chroniclers, or, or whether it is a self-motivated person who makes and writes the observations himself or herself. What are some of the characteristics of British writings? Before we come to that, let us be clear about the time frame we are talking about. And as this slide shows, the period that we are talking about is really the one which is enclosed in the blue rectangle out here, which is the first half of the 19th century till the middle of the 20th century. This was a period when important developments were taking place the world over in science, and the publication of the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which happened on 24th November 1859, was one of the major landmark events. This book, as we all know, brought about a major paradigm shift in biology and influenced subsequent work in ecology, genetics, systematics, so on and so forth. In context of colonial India, the study of its birds, the time period in the blue rectangle covers the period when some of the most important workers on Indian birds, such as Sykes, Hodgson, Jordan, Blythe, Blanford, Oates, Pinn, and later workers such as Aitken, Douglas Dewar, Hugh Whistler, Stuart Baker, and many others were active. So this is really an important period from the point of view of the development of ornithology in India, and as we know, throughout the world as well. The next picture shows the title page of one of the most significant earlier works on Indian ornithology, which is The Birds of India by T.C. Jordan. What I find very fascinating about the title page is that the publisher seemed to have used all available font types and sizes, leaving no known typeface unutilized. However, the really significant point is that the work is dated post 1857. This is an important point. Most of the significant works on Indian ornithology are dated post 1857, which was the year of the Indian Sepoy Mutiny or the Great Uprising. 1857 also marks the transition from East India Company to the Crown, and some of these changes are reflected in the natural history writings as well. Nearly all the books on birds in British India were published post 1857. So in some ways, as this slide shows, the British rule in India in the pre-1857 period, or the East India Company days, life for the British residents was very different from the later phase, which is the post-1857 phase. Of course, there was constant turmoil even in the post-1857 phase, but perhaps in a relative sense, the latter period was also more settled. In the East India Company days, the type of British in India were different from those who came later. In the latter phase of British rule in India, many were career civil servants. However, in the East India Company days, the type of British who lived in India were different in terms of their attitudes towards India and towards the natives. We get some idea of this in the form of various books that have appeared, and in fact, some books on this subject have appeared just last year. But one thing is that while many British officers could not afford to bring their families from England in the days of the Company Raj due to an unsettled life, disease, career, and uncertainty, now came civil servants with their families. And one of the most well-known cases, fictional cases, is that of Foster's Passage to India, in which a British woman traveled to India to meet her fiancé. So all in all, life in the post-1857 phase was perhaps more settled, and the elements of a settled life in India meant often living in bungalows, which were often located in the civil lines or the cantonments. Inside the house, there would be a host of servants or domestic help at hand. Common elements of the local landscape included the church, the bungalow, the garden in the compound, etc. So, I mean, in the last picture, we've seen what a bungalow looks like. And one of the aspects of living in civil lines in bungalows was having a home garden. And a home garden, there seems to be no concept of such a thing as a home garden in traditional Indian dwellings, be it a haveli or a mahal. Much research has been done on this, and the question is, why was there an emphasis on having a home garden in India? Well, the obvious answer is that it was to provide greenery or some sort of relief to eyes tired from seeing the constant brownness all around. But as some authors have also pointed out, home gardens served the purpose of creating social distancing from the natives. In other words, maintaining some distance between the sahib and the local native. But from our point of view, it is the birds and bird writings, of course, which are of significance. Because quite differently from an earlier period, where we had the explorer type of naturalist who undertook arduous journeys to remote locations in the hills or in the desert looking for birds. Now we had more people doing bird watching by just staying at home and looking at birds in their home gardens. And not surprisingly, quite a few books about birds in an Indian garden are in existence. I mean, three of them are listed here. Birds of an Indian Garden by Fletcher and Inglis, Birds in the Garden in Low Country Wet Zone of Ceylon, and Garden in Aviary Birds. So all of these books were published at different time periods. So uh, uh, because quite a few casual or general bird watching was now being done at home, we find a mention of garden birds in diverse types of writings. For instance, even in fiction writing, as is the case in the works of Kipling, to which we'll come to in the next slide. So besides scientific ornithological works, one important genre of natural history writings by British is books of general interest about nature. And here we find, several examples. And the common elements of the garden in the compound and its denizens appear in the fictional writings of that period. For instance, in Kipling's writings, the story of Rikki Tikki Tavi about a mongoose known as Rikki killing a cobra is told in the background of a home garden with familiar birds making an appearance. Common birds such as the coppersmith barbet and the tailor bird, also known as darzi, are among some birds which figure in this story. The coppersmith barbet making its tong, tong, tong sound from an unseen spot in the trees could be heard knocking all day. Warblers like the familiar darzi, the tailor bird, lived in the garden hedge. So Rikki Tikki Tavi, Kipling's classic is of course the story about high drama in a home garden. But it has all the familiar bird elements embedded in it. One of the masters of the art of nature storytelling and in the process creating a unique writing style is E.H. Atkins, also known as EHA, who was also among the founders of the Bombay Natural History Society. And some of his most famous works include Birds of Bombay and Naturalist on the Prowl. In fact, there's a famous cartoon which depicts him as a lean and tall, typical Jack Sprat type of a person. We see it here. with a backpack, possibly containing a tiffin, wearing a hat and looking at birds through binoculars. Uh, so, just to talk about his easy writing style, here's a sample of some of his writings. He's talking about a small bird which has started nesting in his home garden. And he begins by wondering, you may live in the same garden with a little bird and meet it many times a day and never know that it is married and has a family. I mean, this is a unique way to start a conversation, almost as if the bird was human. He goes on to say, and I quote here, for weeks, the courtship went under your windows till she accepted him and left his rival to look for another love. Then the young couple explored every tree in the garden for suitable premises. One branch was tried and rejected on account of the ants. Another was fixed on but spoiled next day by the pruning knife of the Mali. So Mali, it's interesting to note that Atkins uses typical Indian terms in his descriptions. For instance, he says one branch was tried and rejected on account of the ants. Another was fixed but was spoiled next day by the Mali. Now, Mali is what a gardener is called in India. So he also often employed Indian terms in his writings. And then, of course, he goes on, at length, a cozy little site was found close by the path which you would traverse every day. Materials were collected, and for many days, the birds were busy from early morning building the house. So, from the writings of British writers on Indian birds, it would seem that they had a particular fascination for one group of garden birds, those are the ones which belong to the cuckoo family. Back home in England, the number of species in this family of birds is much less compared to the variety of cuckoos that we get to see in India. And here we see at least four of there are dozens and dozens of species of cuckoos, members of the cuckoo family to be found in the Indian subcontinent. Here we there are pictures of just four of the most common forms. We have the pied-crested cuckoo, then the quail, the totally black bird, the male quail, the hawk cuckoo, and of course, what is known as the crow pheasant, which looks like a crow and is actually a cuckoo. You can see the red eyes very clearly. But it would seem that the cuckoos really fascinated the British, and they had interesting habits, one of which was known as brood parasitism, laying their eggs in the nests of other birds, from which arose the term and notion of cuckoldry. The habits of cuckoos had, of course, been written about before. For instance, in the Babar-Nama, the memoirs of the Mughal Emperor Babur, we find mention of it. We also find a mention of it in earlier works, in earlier Sanskrit works, for instance, in Dave's book. The subject of brood parasitism, it would seem, really upset the Britishers very much. And perhaps that is why a book with such a title as Cuckoo Problems came to be written on this dreadful subject. Of course, the book is not about so much about as much of the dreadful subject, but it's a technical ornithological work on cuckoos, different species of cuckoos. There was, among the Indian cuckoos, there was one particular species which nearly drove them mad. This was the hawk cuckoo, which became particularly vocal during the hot months. It can be heard during the monsoon or the rainy period as well, though in winter it is mostly silent. And this cuckoo really irritated the Britishers so much, particularly its harsh, high-pitched call, that they decided to name it the brain fever bird due to its peculiar call. It is interesting how the British natural history writers chose to describe the call. And I have here a description from one of the books about birds, on garden birds of India, the one by Fletcher and Inglis, published in 1936. And they describe it as follows. The appearance of the hawk cuckoo is probably less familiar to most people than its note, which has aptly earned for it the notorious title of the brain fever bird. Our Indian gardens and groves contain many sweet-voiced singers amongst their avian denizens, and a few whose voices are less grateful to the ear. But there is not one whose notes consist of such ear-splitting and nerve-wracking cries as do those of the brain fever bird. With the most annoying persistence and reiteration, this bird repeats its cry, which bears a remarkable resemblance to the word brain fever, repeated in a piercing shriek running up the scale. The cry may also be written as pipiha, and in some districts, the word vernacular name of the bird is given as pupiha. Another rendering of the call, which includes the overture preceding the triple note, is oh Lord, how very hot it's getting. We feel it, we feel it, we feel it. The call is extremely loud and shrill and can be heard. Indeed, it cannot but be heard within a radius of several hundred yards. But one of the most annoying things about it is its intermittent character. And then they go on to say that, the coppersmith tonking in the garden all day is hardly heard consciously unless one listens for it. But the shrieks of the brain fever bird burst their way without ceremony into one's inner consciousness, whether awake or asleep, and one cannot help but hear them. We feel it, we feel it, we feel it. Go the cries up and up the scale and then suddenly stop, and one hopes fervently that this fan in bird's plumage has burst its throat or at least flown away out of earshot. But no, after a short interval, it begins again and may continue for hours at a stretch. Very often, the performance commences just at dusk when it has got too dark to make out the culprit and lasts all night without intermission. When this sort of thing takes place on a really hot night, the victim who is attempting to woo sleep after a hard day's work may well be excused if the first dim dawn sees him sallying forth on vengeance bent. But vengeance is not always easy to attain. The bird usually perches high up in a tall tree and keeps so still and is so inconspicuously colored that even when it shrieks, locate the very branch whereon it is sitting, it is not always easy to make out. Furthermore, it is wary and often flies off as soon as it sees that it has been detected. So this is how the bird was described in their writings. And just to give you an idea what it sounds like, here is an audio of the call. Thank you.
Thank you, Urfi. That was really fascinating and provided a great context for Lady Gwillim's work and her influence. We have a bunch of questions. I'll read them out. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone that the chat is open and type your questions in there. As I often tell my students, there are no dumb questions, so don't be shy. And we have about 30 minutes, and I'll try to alternate between our speakers when I ask the question. So the first question is for Subbu, and this is from Srinivas. He asks, did she spend her time in the field making observations, or was she mostly making observations from her garden?
I don't think there's no indication, even in her letters, that she went about exploring the wilds around Madras. The sisters were mostly interested in painting the birds, plants, and the landscapes. Also, they observed like a lot of the local traditions, people, how they lived. There are a lot of writings about them, but per se on natural history explorations, I have no indications. There are no indication of them doing that.
Excellent. Great, thanks. And Dr. Urfi, Ashish Pitti, who wrote this wonderful book summarizing Southeast Asian ornithology and the literature, mentions that John Gould had actually published his book on the birds of Asia before 1850. I don't think you mentioned him in your talk, and in fact, those paintings were probably done by Elizabeth Gould, who doesn't get any credit. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, John Gould's work is of course there, and I think in that slide I showed you about the time scale, which is actually not my slide; it has been made by someone else. There's a mention of John Gould, but the point that I was trying to emphasize in my talk was more about the style of writings, and I mean, let's face it, that the bulk of the writings really happened in the post 1857 phase, when the transition happened from the East India Company to the Crown, and that is the time when a more settled sort of a life came into existence, and we find lots of books on garden birds being written, and bird watching as a hobby among people. British people developed, and that's where there's a time when most of these books by good writers such as Aitken and Douglas Dever and so many others have come out. Of course, Gould's book has great significance and its paintings, but I really did not focus much on that.
Okay, excellent. Next question is for Subu, and this is from Rebecca Ann Kapelovich, and she asks, were Lady Elizabeth and her sisters recognized as naturalists in their own lifetimes, or is it only recently?
I don't think so. I would say they were, we should recognize them as very good painters, because they never did any explorations within the time that they were there around Madras. They were more interested in paintings.
So if I could ask a question to follow up on that, why do you think that their work was never published?
I don't know. Elizabeth died rather quite early in her life. Probably they were thinking about publishing it, but never got to do that. And after Elizabeth died and her sister and her husband came back to England, I don't know what happened later.
Okay, good. And for Dr. Urfi, are there bird portraits and records created by other South Asian naturalists? And I guess a follow-up to that, were the Gwillims aware of any other South Asian naturalists? So obviously the Gwillims were English, but were there people who were native to Southeast Asia who were publishing on birds around that time? Dr. Urfi?
Yeah, are you talking about the period that we just spoke about?
Yes, I would say generally 1800s, 1700s.
I'm not too sure about if I've got the question correct. What you're asking me is that were there books being published by people who were not residents in India?
Yeah, people who are not from England, I guess, is a good way of saying that.
Ah, right. Well, yeah. I mean, in Hume's, Ellen Hume's works, what was notable about Ellen Hume, who's also regarded as the father of Indian ornithology, he had a network of correspondents who were sending him notes from all across India. And so in that list of Hume's correspondents, we find people from French and other nationalities as well contributing to Hume's notes, and all of those names are acknowledged in the books that were written by Hume, for instance. So in that sense, it was, of course, and there are a few Indians as well who have been acknowledged in Hume, but very few in number. So yes, there were certainly lots of others who were Russians. There's some Russian names as well. So plenty of people.
Okay, good, thanks. Subu, this is for you from Monique Boivin. does the study of the Gwillims shed any light on current ornithological research? And I think by that she means, did they have some insights that we can use today to understand
Yes,
more about
because
birds?
some of the species that they have painted, observed, are no longer seen in the present day bird life. This one, there's something inside that I'm exploring. And also as to, because one of the aspects we're exploring that that some of the species that Elvis painted were not even described when she painted those birds during Madras, when she stayed in Madras. So ornithologically, some of her work becomes very, very interesting scientifically. And there have been changes in the ornithology of the region since the time that Elizabeth and Mary were there in Madras.
Okay, excellent. And Urfi, this is from Reshma. And this person asks, why can't we hear the coal calling during the winter season? Are they migratory?
Yeah, I mean, they're mostly silent during the winter season. It's a migratory bird, and one of the unique things about the quail is it's a horizontal migrant. You know, it's not a north-south. It's not on a north-south axis. But anyway, so it is mostly silent during the winters, and it's extremely vocal during the hot summer months and in the monsoon.
Excellent. Okay, this is just a comment from Mirinal Kapadia, and this person says, the recent Forgotten Masters exhibition at the Wallace Collection in London featured many watercolors by Indian artists, primarily from the Impe album. Does either of you know about that or want to comment?
Subbu might.
No.
Okay, fair enough. I have a couple of questions I'm just going to ask while some others come in. As you probably know, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II published a seminal work on falconry in about 800 AD. I didn't publish it; he wrote a manuscript, and in that manuscript he acknowledges that he got a lot of his information about falconry from a Mughal emperor. Do you know if that person came from India or where that was from? Seems like there's an interesting connection there between the Mughal falconers and Frederick II.
No, I mean there was one person from Afghanistan who had lived in India, and he had written a book on falcons. He was from one of the royal families of Afghanistan, but I mean that is pretty recent. So I really don't know about this thing.
Okay, good. While I have you on, Urfi, JVD Murti asks from Hyderabad, are there any records of exclusive writings on birds in ancient Indian literatures? I do know of the Panchatantra, Sukha Saptatai, but anything exclusive on birds?
Well, I mean, the book that I have come across and in translation and that has got all the information in English is the one called Birds in Sanskrit Literature by Dave. And the thing is that, I mean, it has mention of several birds that were described in myths and, stories, and also from other sources. Many of them are intertwined in those stories and myths. So that's one source. What I was trying to emphasize today's talk was that there's a difference in the later writings, especially done by the Europeans, that it was more towards trying to correlate the presence absence of a bird in a locality in relation to its the features of the locality. We don't find much evidence of that sort of writings, at least those that are available in translation right now. I guess this is an important area of research, and people really need to work more in this and find out. Perhaps Professor Subbu might want to add something to this if he has.
No, I think that's it, I guess. Yes.
Mhm.
Subo, I have a question for you. Um, do you know how the birds that Lady Gwillim painted were actually trapped? Were they netted or some
She
kind of trap?
employed quite a few local trappers, and she does not mention about the techniques of what these trappers employed. Birds were sourced; they were brought in to her, and she painted them. But she has not gone out to see how the birds have been trapped, or she has not does not mention anything about it in her letters. Only the backgrounds in her paintings indicate that she inquired a lot about with the trappers as to where the birds were found. Accordingly, she added the components or background. But not even in a single painting, any bird has been painted in their natural settings, indicating that she actually observed those birds and painted them
Right.
in natural settings.
Do you know what happened to the birds when she finished with them? Did she let them go?
No, some of the letters they say that she was quite hasty in painting because she never wanted to hold the bird for long, and so most of these birds were released. In some cases, if the birds became very stressed, she would release them even before the painting was completed.
Okay, good, thanks. Dr. Urfi, Arun Agnihotri asks, do we have any evidence of documentation or observations or notes by non-Europeans in India, in other words, in the local Indian languages, or is it all Europeans?
I think we don't, I mean, we have information on birds by Indians in context of cage birds or birds that were, I mean, there's a book written, published in Bengali about caged birds and, you know, that sort of things. But birds in the wild and birds, how they sort of, you know, exist in their natural habitat and their ecology, what we now call as ecology, and so on and so forth. I really don't know, and that's something that perhaps I mean, this is also something for you know, researchers to dig into and try to unearth if there are any writings. I mean, a lot of writings over the past few hundred years are likely to be those which were written under the influence, the European influence of science, so-called Renaissance, Indian Renaissance, which happened. And that happened in most of the places where you know, the British had a strong presence, as in Calcutta or in Madras. These were the two port cities. So and this is where all the societies of scientific societies came up. So if there were any writings which arose from these, that I really don't know. But prior to this period, if there were any genuine natural history writings, I guess this is really something which a historian needs to dig out.
Okay, great. And Subu, a question for you. Are the correspondences, sorry, the correspondence by the sisters accessible anywhere? Who were they corresponding with at this time? And was it someone in England? Was it commissioned by some biologist, or was it out of personal interest? Are the letters currently placed?
They corresponded with their mother and sister, mother in Hereford and sister in London. And they sent a lot of gift material to a lot of people. And in their letters, they indicate that, can you please pass on this gift to that particular person? So they were in touch with their mother and sister. There was a primary contact. From there, things and letters got dispersed to various
And
people.
where are those letters now?
Letters are all found in British Library in 4 bound volumes. And of course, people can go and access those letters.
Okay, excellent. Urfi, you set up a set of differences between earlier Indian writings about natural life and 19th century British writings. I wonder how much the differences have to do with context, the difference in time period, and what survives, rather than the intellectual background, European versus Indian. And Marika Sardar asked that question.
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, that's, I mean, for instance, I mean, some of the writings that I am more familiar with in translation, of course, from in the pre-British period is writings by, say, Jahangir, who could, I mean, who had a great interest in natural history, and he could, I mean, that's one thing. That's being very skillful at, natural. I mean, being a good naturalist and a scientific study. Those are, I think, two different things. So she's asking, rather than an intellectual background, European versus Indian. I mean, I have my own sort of thinking, but I really can't say much at this point.
Thank you. This question from Holly Schaefer, and I think it's addressed to either one of you who'd like to answer it. Have you come across references to the transport and purchase of birds from other countries for the sake of natural history collection, painting, or writing, like from Java or Canton? Not the natural migration, but human-enabled movement. And I assume this person is asking about movement to India.
In the garden on collections, there was a cockatoo, there was a cassowary, and the crested partridge. They must have come from trade through other countries to India. And also they had East India Company had a base in Calcutta. Probably there was a movement of materials from these two camps. So they must have sourced those materials from within their contacts.
Okay, good. I as an ornithologist, I can't imagine transporting a cassowary from anywhere. Must have been a real chore.
They do mention in the letters that there was a cassowary in the garden.
Yes, I saw that, but they're quite large and vicious birds, so
very vicious
dangerous.
Birds.
Yeah. Okay.
Bob,
yes.
may I add something
yes,
to
of course.
the previous question by Marika Sardar? I mean, I did mention in my talk that there could be a difference perhaps between an emperor who's greatly interested in natural history dictating his observations to a person who writes them down. That's one thing. One that tells us one thing about interest in natural history. But then it's quite another thing to have a whole lot of common people who in various professions like doctors, surgeons, lawyers, and so on and so forth, businessmen, to have a overall interest in natural history. So I think that sort of the difference in the way society is structured, that perhaps makes a difference. I really can't say much about the thing that she has asked in parentheses, European versus Indian. I really wouldn't like to say anything on this thing. But the other point being that there's a difference if there's a whole lot of common people involved in a scientific study of birds, and it's another thing to have a person who's an emperor and who's a keen naturalist, who will be dictating his notes, I mean, and mind you, the interest in natural history also arose from game hunting and shikar and so on and so forth.
Okay, Subu, is anything known about who Webb was?
We don't know, because cotton, just get a mention about him cultivating cotton on his farm. In those times, cotton was being cultivated and exported to England. Other than that, we don't have much information on Mr. Webb. Okay, good. We've run out of questions from outside, so I think I'll end this with one question of my own. And that is, were you or Casey Wood able to identify all of the species that Lady Gwillim painted? Casey would try to get most of the birds identified, but there are identification issues. At least some 14 species have not been properly identified. We'll be tackling that within the network project work as well. Okay, excellent. Some other species have not identified. Excellent. I'd like to thank you both for great seminars and remind everyone who's still tuned in that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available soon, and maybe Nora can address that. Thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful seminar, and thank you, everyone, for attending this session of Gwillim Online. As Bob mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending you the link shortly. We look forward to welcoming you at our upcoming presentations. You will receive an invitation to our next session, which will take place Monday, August 4th at 9 a.m. EDT. And will feature Professor Jeffrey Spears from New York talking about the Devadasi with a special musical accompaniment. Merci de votre présence aujourd'hui, et we look forward to welcoming you again at Gwillim Online. Thank you.